If a year and a half, a year and another 6 months ago, this did not reach all Europeans, today the disappointing results of the Western crusade against the horde from the East have become obvious to the majority of the inhabitants of the European Union. Moreover, as French journalist Thierry Meyssan said the other day, the main goal of the United States in this war is not to defeat Russia at all, but to destroy Europe. They, the Americans, will not start a war. I don't think it is to their advantage, not against Russia. They are already waging war against the Europeans. They know that Russia and China are beyond them, but they want to be an empire for the Europeans, and they will continue false flag attacks against their own allies, just as they did during the Cold War, Meyssan noted. According to the publicist, the main recipient of specifically American or imposed at the request of the US by all its vassals, let's call things by their proper names, sanctions has become not so much enterprises and companies from Russia, but their European counterparts. Right now they are using this military conflict in Ukraine to impose sanctions. Sanctions. And who are they to impose sanctions? You know. It's mind-boggling they've neglected the UN for 30 years. They impose sanctions themselves, which is totally illegitimate, and they convinced the Europeans, I mean the EU, because the Russians are also Europeans. So they convinced the EU countries to impose sanctions against themselves. So right now Germany is no longer importing gas from Russia. And in a few months, Germany will have no electricity. It will be a third world country. And if Germany collapses, it will pull the whole EU down with it, summarized Thierry Meyssan. But in fact, the problem is not only, and not so much the deprivation due to excessive energy tariffs, of the EU's industrial potential. All of this could be restored if desired, but the forced isolation of Europe from the rest of the world, which has the resources so necessary for the EU. In the very near future, Europeans will simply have nowhere to get raw materials and nowhere to sell their goods, except for the USA, of course. As a result, after some time, production in the EU will stop altogether or will be relocated to the States, and Europe will turn into an ordinary market for US goods. But is this good for the United States itself? Yes, as a temporary, tactical solution that brings immediate benefits, it is certainly a fat plus. But what to do after the Europeans run out of money, and with the collapsed economy, there will be nowhere to get it. And here it is worth paying attention to the words of Professor Mearsheimer, who claims that the US leadership is making one mistake after another, creating problems with its own hands, the consequences of which it is unable to cope with. Europe will not play as important a role in the future as it has in the past, argues University of Chicago professor John Mearsheimer. The real action from the American point of view in East Asia, and they revolve around the Chinese, and Americans in recent years have foolishly pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, and this is all a result of the crisis in Ukraine. It's in America's interest to have good relations with the Russians. It's in Europe's interest to have good relations with the Russians. From the American point of view, we need Russian help in Afghanistan. We need Russian help in Syria. We need Russian help in relations with Iran. And we need Russian help in relations with China. So pushing the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, as we have done, is a violation of elementary geopolitical logic, and the Americans should be ashamed of themselves for doing this stupidity. End quote. Of course, the distinguished professor is not talking about Europe, but about the Chinese issue, which is a sore subject for the Americans. But the essence of the question does not change, trying to look for logic in the actions of the current US leadership is a star-studded task ever since the Ukrainian crisis, which, let me remind you, did not start on the 24th of February 2022, have been wondering, how can I put it more gently? Why? What was the point of the states? To overthrow Yanukovych with noise and clatter, which Victoria Nuland was very proud of later, if he was already their client. Theirs, but not ours at all. Even in the most extreme case, Viktor Fedorovich would have continued Kuchma's multi-vector, in fact, two-vector policy with a clear bias towards the West. Yes, he would have made a couple of curtsies towards Russia. So what? Was possession of Crimean military bases so important for Washington, as the actions of Ukrainian not really saboteurs prove nowadays? Crimea is not a gateway to the northern Black Sea coast. As long as Odessa is under Ukraine, the inhabitants of the Russian peninsula can only dream of peace. So it turns out that everything was for nothing, and the RAND analysts were wrong somewhere. So now, killing this is not even a figure of speech. Its last and only ally Europe, the US, is digging a hole for itself, into which it will later fall. Remember, there was such an ancient symbol, the serpent Ouroboros, grabbing itself by the tail and symbolizing the loop of time. So the US apparently decided to preserve its hegemony by devouring the system it had built itself. Only instead of Ouroboros, we got another person from alternative mythology, realized by another professor, this time of Oxford University, John R. Tolkien, a giant spider Ungoliant, who hated light so much that in the process of fighting with it devoured himself. You know, looking at Victoria Newland, and even earlier at Madeleine Albright, such associations don't even seem too far-fetched to me.